Thank you all for coming. It is a huge pleasure to introduce this evening's debate, and I want to begin by thanking all of you for coming. As part of the commemoration of 500 years since the completion of the stonework of this chapel, we are celebrating one of King's most impressive alumni. John Maynard Keynes began as an undergraduate here in 1902, became a fellow soon after, and never really left. In 1930, he asked, what can we reasonably expect the level of our economic life to be 100 years hence? What are the economic possibilities for our grandchildren? It is this question that we are asking today, as we near the year that Keynes was thinking about. 2015, like 1930, can perhaps be characterized as a time of prevailing pessimism. Keynes claimed this pessimism was misplaced, as he predicted that by 2030, the economic problem of scarcity would be solved or close to being solved. Seemingly, it is time for a re-evaluation. To do so, on our panel we have Lord Skidelsky of Tilton. Robert is Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at the University of Warwick, and author of the award-winning 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes. Anne Pettifor. Anne is the Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics and Fellow of the New Economics Foundation. She is part of Jeremy Corbyn's new Economic Advisory Committee. Professor Sir Partha Dasguptha. Partha is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Cambridge University and has written a number of books, from human well-being and the natural environment to economics, a very short introduction. Professor Andrew Gamble. Andrew is Professor of Politics at Cambridge University, whose latest book, Crisis Without End, The Unravelling of Western Prosperity, was published last year. Before we begin and give each speaker 7 minutes uninterrupted and open up the floor to you, we will hear from Professor Roberto Unger. Roberto is a renowned philosopher, politician, and social theorist, based in Harvard, who counts, amongst others, President Obama as one of his former students. He is currently Brazilian Minister of Strategic Affairs. He sent us this video to introduce the topic, what are the economic possibilities for our grandchildren?
We are used to thinking of the economy as the reign of scarcity. And then, according to some of the proponents of this view, once we overcome scarcity, we can turn to our private pleasures and to the private sublime. But a better way of thinking of the economy is to view the work of production as an opportunity for the construction of humanity, to turn the realm of scarcity into the terrain of freedom, of a deeper freedom. There is a feature of economic history that should give us hope. In every historical circumstance, there is a more advanced practice of production. The most advanced practice is the practice that is closest to the imagination. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, it was mechanized manufacturing. And every sector of the economy, even agriculture, was eventually transformed on the model of mechanized manufacturing. Now we have in the world a new advanced sector, characterized by the accumulation not only of capital and technology, but also of knowledge. In this new economy, production is committed to permanent innovation. The contrast between conception and execution is attenuated. All specialized work roles are relativized. and the best firms become more like the best schools. There is a fateful question for the future of humanity. Will this new advanced sector, the knowledge-based economy, include only a privileged elite, or will its practices be disseminated throughout much of the economic order, including the majority? On that question, our economic future turns. The new advanced practices of production should, in principle, be even more applicable to every sector of the economy than mechanized manufacturing was. And yet we find the opposite. We find that this new vanguardism on the whole remains quarantined in isolated parts of the economy weakly linked to the other parts of the national economic order. They depend on very special conditions of high knowledge and high trust. We must therefore act collectively and politically to create the conditions for the dissemination of these advanced practices throughout the economy. To the extent that we succeed, we shall have three opportunities that also present us with three tasks. The first is to change the relation between the person and the machine. In past periods of economic history, the worker acted as if he were one of his machines in Adam Smith's pin factory or in Henry Ford's assembly line. In the future, what we should desire is that the machine allow us to reserve our time for everything that we have not yet learned how to repeat. Whatever we've learned how to repeat, we express in a formula, and then we embody the formula in the physical contraption, the machine. The worker then becomes increasingly the opposite of the machine. And the combination of the worker and the machine accomplishes much more than either could achieve alone. The second task is to change the nature of free labor. There are three forms of free work: wage labor, self-employment, and cooperation. In the 19th century, it was universally believed by liberals as well as by socialists that wage labor remained tainted by features of serfdom and slavery, and must eventually give way to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, combined or not with each other. It was only in the 20th century that the predominance of wage labor as the default form of free work began to be naturalized. Now the economic order that is emerging in the world with the new advanced practice of production gives us a chance to renew the 19th century ideal in a new form. Wage labor will then take its place alongside self-employment and cooperation as only one of the forms of free work. We cannot achieve these first two goals, changing the relation between the person and the machine, and establishing a greater space for self-employment and cooperation, unless we also execute a third task. The third task is to prevent the market economy from being fastened to a single version of itself. If we are to be able to experiment with new ways of relating people to machines and new forms of organizing free work. We must be able better to combine decentralized economic initiative with the large-scale aggregation of resources, economies of scale. We cannot do that within the limits of the traditional property regime. We need to be able to experiment with alternative forms of decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities. Different regimes of private and social property should come to coexist experimentally within the same market economy. The axis of ideological controversy in the world for 200 years has been the state against the market. More state, less market, more market, less state, or some synthesis of market and state. Under this view, we can do only two things with the market economy. We can regulate it, or we can attenuate its inequalities through retrospective and compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. What we cannot do is what we must in fact now do, which is to reinvent the market economy, the institutional arrangements and the legal rules that make it what it is, so that more people can have more access to more markets in more ways, but also so that we can create a basis on which the most advanced practice of production, the knowledge-based productive activity, can be propagated throughout the entire economy and include the majority of the labor force. Our success in these projects depends on two large conditions that lie outside the economy. The first condition is the education of the people. There must be a form of education that is focused on analytic capabilities rather than on information, that sacrifices encyclopedic superficiality to selective depth, that organizes teaching and learning through cooperative practices, and above all, that introduces every subject from contrasting points of view. The second major condition is the reinvention of democratic politics. We have now in the world only low-energy democracies. They perpetuate the rule of the living by the dead. They prevent us from being able to master and to change the structure of society. And they make change depend on crisis. What we need are high-energy democracies that give us, without trauma, the prerogative of transformation, elevating the level of organized popular engagement in political life, dissolving impasse rapidly, and allowing us, in different parts of a country or different sectors of a society, to create countermodels of the national future. These endeavors are informed and inspired by a vision of who we are and what we can become. We immeasurably exceed all the finite circumstances of our existence and all the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. Our aim is so to conduct our lives and to arrange our societies that we can become more human by becoming more godlike, and die only once.
Okay, we're now going to start the debate, as it were. He went over his 7 minutes slightly. We're going to start with Robert, who's got 7 minutes now. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the mic up? I mean, if you're on video, you can't be stopped, can you? Just turn off the video. I'm Robert Skidelsky. I've just been reading a brilliant book by Keith Thomas called The Ends of Life. It's about ethical attitudes in early modern England. And he has one chapter on work and vocation. This shows how divided attitudes were even then. On the one hand, you had the classical view of work as drudgery. On the other hand, the Christian view, once confined to monks, now extended to the professions, of work as a calling or a vocation. The first feeds into economics, the second into Marx, sociology, socialism. Now, these two traditions still dominate our attitude to the future of work. The work as drudgery school looks forward to the expanded leisure which abundance will make possible. And this indeed was the message of Keynes's economic possibilities for our grandchildren. However, that view has always been challenged by the work as vocation school, which sees work as the path to human fulfillment, a view expressed by Professor Unger this evening. Now, how do we decide between these work as drudgery and work as fulfillment perspectives? Or are we simply trapped in a semantic muddle which treats leisure and work as opposites, the one standing for idleness, the other standing for activity? Bertrand Russell, a notably clear thinker, failed to clarify matters in his essay In Praise of Idleness, which is not about idleness at all, but actually about a form of playfulness which he contrasts with passive consumption. The distinction Keynes, who was certainly not idle, was trying to get at was between work done as a means to earning a living and work done for its own sake. Most people would accept that there is no hard and fast line between the two. We may do something mainly for the money or mainly for the pleasure of doing it. The difference being not absolute, but coming from the degree to which we need to work to earn a living. And I'd add something else. Work is, of course, less physical than it was in the past, but that doesn't mean it's more fulfilling. It's a mistake often made. The fulfillment one gets out of work seems to be not at all closely connected to the amount of physical toil it entails. Office work can be drudgery. Carpentry can be fulfilling. And so it's a superficial view to say that because work is less of a toil, it's therefore bound to become more interesting. Nevertheless, it is true that there is widespread fear of leisure. Why do we fear leisure? For this, I think there are two reasons. The obvious one is that for most people, it means unemployment. In the modern era of job insecurity, it's only natural that people should resist any call for them to choose leisure, and economists don't help by calling unemployment a choice for leisure. And with automation eating up more and more jobs, people are naturally afraid for their future livelihood. This brings me to the more profound reason for fear of leisure. We have scarcely begun thinking about how to provide replacement incomes for the jobs which humans are no longer required to do. We assume that unemployment will be a transitional phase on the way to better jobs, more jobs, producing different goods and services to supply ever-expanding needs or wants. That's the way we see the future. But that's a delusion. It's if only because we will soon run up against natural limits to growth. That is growth which doesn't destroy the planet. So we have to provide people with replacement incomes, incomes outside the labour market, which will grow over time to provide them with an expanding choice between work and leisure. That's exactly how Keynes would have seen the transition to a more leisurely future. Remember, that essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, was a jeu d'esprit. It was only 10 pages. There's nothing practical in it. There's no talk about distribution, for example, which would be essential to realizing a more leisured society. But it's an inspiration all the same, and it's a sign of the poverty of our social imagination that nearly 100 years after he wrote this visionary tract, we still haven't started to work out the practicalities of turning the vision into reality.
Thank you very much. Anne.
Right. Thank you very much. And it's a great honour to speak here at the celebration of kings and of Keynes. The greatest honour I could do both is to get down to business and speak very frankly, which is what I will do. In my view, the world desperately needs to recover Keynes. But to do so, it also needs to confront some deeply uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and the acceptance or otherwise of ideas. In his 1902 book, Imperialism, John Hobson observed, "No one can follow the history of political and economic theory during the last century without recognizing that the selection and rejection of ideas, hypotheses, and formulae, the molding of them into schools or tendencies of thought, and the propagation of them in the intellectual world have been plainly directed by the pressure of class interests. In political economy, we find the most incontestable example of this. Given the pressure of class interests on today's economic ideas and economic professions, the long-standing neglect of Keynes's ideas, most significantly here in Cambridge, comes as no surprise. The molds of schools of thought, now dominant in both economics but also wider society, have led to a vast and prolonged failure of the global economy. A failure to provide people with work, stability, a decent standard of living, and in the light of this weekend's events in Paris, security. According to the ILO, around 200 million people are now unemployed. The Middle East and North Africa has the highest rate of youth unemployment in the world, probably in its history. Even before 2008, 170 million people in the world had no work. Today, most economists regard unemployment as a non-event, not worthy of consideration as a major indicator of economic health. Instead, the economics profession seeks only to impose the consequent failure of employment and economic activity as the new norm, secular stagnation. The appalling conditions of the world today, in Europe, high unemployment, dominance of liberal unfettered finance, an independent so-called central bank, political tensions and divisions, and the rise of right-wing and even fascist parties are precisely the conditions that Keynes sought to eradicate. From the time of his rejection of the gold standard, Keynes was concerned with the prevention of economic crises. In the wake of the Great Depression, he wanted to establish conditions for the restoration of prosperity and to prevent such events ever recurring again. In this, he clearly failed. But this failure was through no fault of his own. For the Keynes that survived into conventional wisdom, and most importantly, the Keynes that has survived into the lecture theatre, if it is mentioned at all, is a gravely distorted and diminished figure. He is now associated largely with fiscal policies to combat crisis, when to prevent crisis, he was concerned primarily with monetary policies. His objective was the reform of the international financial system, on the one hand, and the setting of low interest rates across the spectrum of lending, short and long, safe and risky and real, on the other. Managed finance and cheap money on a permanent basis were his central ambitions. It is a vain hope that the economics profession's ongoing refusal to reform the international monetary system along the lines proposed by Keynes does not reflect the same forces of class interests outlined by Hobson. But either way, it is time the profession woke up to the impossibly high stakes of its intransigence and neglect of Keynes, most notably the neglect here in Cambridge. From a theoretical perspective, Keynes was a monetary economist, understanding immediately that conventional or classical economics was irrelevant to an economy based on credit. In the classical theory, the rate of interest is passive, a passive consequence of whatever real events are regarded as dictating outcomes. Today, neoclassical economists appeal to these events to explain a global savings glut, changes in population growth, and failing productivity. In Keynes's theory, it is the rate of interest that dictates events, and that unchecked is, as he said, the villain of the economic peace. He shares this concern over usury and high rates with 2 millennia of both philosophical and religious doctrines that have held up, for example, the Jubilee principle, fundamentally a rejection of usury. Ultimately, Keynes understood the rate of interest as a social construct set according to the balance of conflicting economic interests. He did not use the language of class, but his theory meant that class struggle was very much a reality. But his view was different from Marx's account. In his view, productive industry and labor shared interests, and these were opposed by finance, what Keynes called vested interests, or the rentier class. Low rates of interest or cheap money favored industry and labor. Dear money, easy dear money, favored finance. The progressive euthanasia of the rentier was for Keynes the price society must pay for A, full employment, B, decent public services and goods, and C, economic stability. Given the rentier was hardly likely to engineer his or her own demise, then the assertion of public authority over the financial system was vital. Until Keynes, finance had been jealously guarded by private authority. Today, such public authority is rejected by mainstream economists who use the deeply imprecise and pejorative notion of financial repression to attack democratic management of the finance sector. Financial repression is akin to regarding the emancipation of slaves as the repression of the rights of slave owners. For the 5 years after the collapse of gold standard, Keynes orchestrated a major realignment of class relations. He imposed democratic public authority over finance. That, of course, has been reversed since the Golden Age. But even though things have moved on very much since the GoldenAge, nevertheless, what we have experienced since then has been 35 years of high unemployment and severe global financial instability. This finally ended with the global financial crisis of 2007-08, after the greatest expansion of private debts probably in the history of the world, which could no longer be sustained. Governments have been and are still required to retrench, to manage low investment, unemployment, and political instability within severe constraints and greatly reduced means. Keynes is only associated with those who argue against going too far. Yet, of course, the retrenchment of governments is resolving nothing. Debt is unresolved, and deflationary forces loom. An emerging authoritarianism is rationalized as reflecting the ineptitude of democracy in the wake of this terrible crisis. The immensity of the power of the finance sector is uncontested to any material extent by both progressive and reactionary forces in society. The power of Keynes' ideas is of a scale that has no precedent. The threat to vested interest is obvious. The fact that the general theory is not recognized or even taught here in Cambridge tells us more about today's economists than about Keynes' stature as a genius, alongside Darwin as a genius. For as Austin Robinson wrote back in the Economic Journal in 1972, if in the process of reappraisal Keynes does not emerge as a truly great man, something, let me repeat, will have gone sadly wrong with the criteria of greatness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Partha.
Oh, sorry. Right. Keynes wrote about the grandchildren following his generation. I want to address the grandchildren, my grandchildren, and those of my contemporaries, and perhaps to the great-grandchildren that we will have, hopefully. Keynes, this beautiful essay, got it wildly wrong, and it tells you about the enormous amount about how dangerous it is to make forecasts. So the forecasts that I will make are not forecasts in the sense of what will happen, but what are the danger zones that we face now that we should be aware of. Whether there will be your generation, and I mean this place is just filled with my children, not yet my grandchildren, I'm not that old, but whether you will be able to handle that is your problem, but we are leaving you with an extremely unworthy earth. He got it wrong on 2 counts, and it's really amazing that he didn't bother to read people who had already written. He thought in terms of a leisure class coming out, and yet we now know, we've seen people working hard as hell. Juliet Score's book on the harried American tells you about the number of hours he works and why. There are many explanations, several explanations, certainly one of which was forecast by Veblen, whose book had been already written. That we care about our neighbors and we want to better them. And that's a rat race, and we work damned hard. He got that wrong. But he got something much more profound wrong. And he could have, if he had spent some time with his colleague, again at King's, A.C. Pigou, he would have probably learned something about what lies ahead. Well, those of you who do some economics would know where I'm heading now, because a great deal of my work is on natural capital and the environment, and the fact that there is this huge amount of natural resource out there which is underpriced. It's underpriced because there are not adequate property rights or institutional arrangements. And that's up for grabs. It's for free. Now, do a mental exercise which requires no mathematics. It's good to have the mathematics, by the way, to assure you that the reasoning is correct. But the intuition gets you a long way. If you have a whole set of factors of production out there, all that stuff that Mother Nature produces for us, free of charge, what do you think technological progress is going to direct attention to? Entrepreneurs are not going to economize on cheap factors. They're going to economize on expensive factors. So you have a technological progress which Keynes was extolling, which has, of course, brought us enormous amount of benefits on one hand, but at the same time, it's extremely rapacious towards nature, because it's geared to using up that stuff out there which is free of charge, or nearly free of charge. And whether it remains free of charge is for your generation to do something about. Where does it lead us to? It tells us that we should not be looking at income, we should not be looking at GDP, because these are indicators which do not take into account the depreciation of natural capital that is taking place even as we speak. The factors of production, if you look at the asset base of an economy, you have manufactured capital, which is the core and substance of economic literature. You have human capital, health, education, and all that we have done marvelously, and that's what Keynes was really putting his finger on. That's absolutely correct. And it has continued to be correct to the extent that now we extol the virtues of our modern society and think that we've never had it so good. But we're looking at income, which is a flow. But what we should be looking at is stocks. And where Keynes really got it wrong in his article was to forget that we ought to be looking at stocks, movements in stocks. And stocks here means, of course, you have to aggregate. You have natural capital, human capital, institutions, and the whole durable set of objects which drive our economies and motivate us, to which we contribute. We ought to be studying the wealth of nations, not the income of nations. Wealth here in an inclusive sense, not in the sense of Adam Smith. The classical economists got it absolutely wrong. The only person who got it reasonably right was Malthus, because he took nature seriously. Is wealth, which includes natural capital. Data. The Inclusive Wealth Report coming out from the United Nations Environment Programme and UNEP 2014 looked at 140 countries over a period 1990 to 2010, and 90% of the countries in the 140 countries, GDP per capita grew. But wealth per capita, extremely crude, by the way, so don't misunderstand me. Everything I say here is extremely tentative because economists haven't bothered to study it. National accountants don't have a handle on it. So you do what you can do, the best you can do, which is to try and value the stuff that we are eroding, which includes forests, some ecosystems, not all. Most ecosystems is missing because the data aren't there. 90% GDP growth per capita grew, so that's good news. That's what Keynes was extolling. But wealth per capita declined increased only in 40% of the countries. So you have a huge gap where GDP growth was going completely counter to where wealth was heading. And so we are essentially leaving you and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, with a very diminished earth. We like to think that technological progress, knowledge, we are proud of it, the Enlightenment, that was fantastic, amazing stuff. But somehow, we have blown it so far. I don't know if it's irreversible or not, by the way. It's convenient to say, deep down, I'm an optimist, I believe things will work, but I see not much evidence of it. It's for you guys, young people, to take the cudgel and say, no, our institutions are wrong, and we have to better it. We have to price, in some way, implicitly or explicitly, the natural capital which we are living off, and we're giving up a diminished earth. That's a pretty pessimistic story, but on the other hand, I don't believe in ancestor worship. Keynes was a great, great thinker, but I think on this one, he really got it wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Andrew.
Okay, well, to follow on from that, I mean, if we go back to the article, it was originally a lecture, what Keynes said was that by 2030 we would be 8 times better off. The power of compound interest, working with private property and capital accumulation meant that by 2030 we would be solving our economic problem. Scarcity would be no more, forced labor would be no more, we would be free from care, from striving, free to enjoy, and this would also lead to a change in morality. And Keynes had a fairly low opinion of Marx, but it's remarkable how on that, Keynes and Marx seem to be on the same page. The famous passage from the German ideology has Marx saying, as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner just as I have a mind. without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. Sounds a bit like retirement, but the problem with that great liberal utopian vision, which in that sense both Marx and Keynes share, is that it doesn't really seem to describe the world that we're currently living in. And just to give you two liberal critiques, there's the critique, the very gloomy critique of the social critic Christopher Lasch, who famously asked, why do serious people continue to believe in the future? And that's a very challenging argument. Why do we continue to believe in the future when the evidence piles up that the future is not going to be a very nice place? And then there's Hayek, who Hayek thought that growth would be liberating in the same way that Keynes thought, but only if we maintained an iron discipline, suppressing the atavistic parts of our nature and maintaining the institutions of the great society, even if they went against our moral instincts. And I think the problem that we face in thinking about the economic possibilities for our grandchildren is that we've had almost 100 years since Keynes first wrote that article, and yet we do seem to be still a long way from solving the economic problem. And now you can say, well, perhaps this is just that Keynes got the timing wrong, that perhaps he was just over-optimistic. Clearly, he doesn't seem, in that article, he doesn't really address the problem of world poverty. And only recently have we seen a major shift taking place in the international economy with the rise of India and China. But we're clearly still at the very beginning of a long process of transition before there is anything like an equal distribution of resources around the world. And I think the problem for me is that we can all see what a future world economy could look like. We can all see the possibilities of further economic growth. But I think we're very conscious of the limits, which are political limits, social limits, environmental limits, to achieving that growth. And if we really want to create a better world for our grandchildren, we're going to have to address some of these very troubling issues which affect the way in which our world is governed at the present time, whether it's trying to get agreements in global governance, whether it's trying to overcome problems of secular stagnation and the crisis of productivity in the advanced countries, whether it's dealing with issues to do with inequality and the legitimacy of distribution, not only within our own societies but around the world. And of course, as Partha was just saying, the critical environmental issues which raise the questions of what kind of adjustments do we need to make in our social institutions, our political institutions, and are we really capable of making them? I'll finish.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for their opening speeches. Before we take questions from the floor, I'd like to give our panelists an opportunity to ask one another a question, come back on any points that have been made. Would anyone like to start us off and question? Yeah, Robert.
Yeah, I'd like to question Partha, Dasguptha. I actually don't, I think Keynes got one or two things wrong, but I don't think he got wrong what Partha said he got wrong. I don't think it was a defect of his analysis that he didn't take into account depletion, coming depletion of natural resources, because he thought growth would come to an end long before you got to the stage when natural resources would start to be, priced higher. I mean, the key concept of his was satiability. He thought that there was a limit to human wants, and that, of course, if there was a limit to human wants, there'd also be a limit to human desire to consume natural resources. And he may have been wrong about that. And I think that is the stronger argument, that he simply ignored the insatiability of wants. I mean, that's the point I want to ask. But the point I also want to make is that no one on the panel, including me, have really considered the effect of automation on jobs and the future of work, which actually makes these choices that I started with rather more urgent than they were in Keynes's day.
Thank you, Partha. Would you like to come back on that quickly?
Okay, well, forecasting it's not my scene. But he was doing it, so he overlooked the fact that presumably if he was forecasting, presumably he ought to have forecasted. I'm being slightly, sorry, I'm not being facetious, I'm being serious. He should have taken into account, if he's forecasting, he should have forecast population growth. And he was certainly interested in the subject. And then it is not at all clear if he could have put his finger onto, say, 1950 even, this is 20 years down. It's true, antibiotics came along during the Second World War approximately, and that kick-started extremely desirably, goes without saying. I mean, I'm looking at the unaccounted for consequences, that's all. I'm not talking about, of course, people are saved, and that's banality, so I won't worry about it. The stationary economy even then would have required a huge resource. At the moment, just at the moment, as we speak, even as we speak, the only kind of data I have at my disposal, and is very crude, and the only reason it's crude is because governments do not want to subsidize research institutions or their statistical offices to get that kind of data. The national accounts systems absolutely stinks in terms of what we are discussing, what I'm discussing here. There are no accounts of stocks. It's all flows, consumption, investment, GDP, and so forth. The only data we have now that I can reliably report is the one that comes out from Berkeley, of the school from Matthias Wackernagel and his group, who try to estimate the ecological footprint of humanity. Starts from a local basis and tries to aggregate. It's full of pitfalls, just as GDP calculations are. But what we have is that we are at the moment consuming at a rate at 1.5 times the regenerative rate of the biosphere and the oceans. That's not sustainable. And it's in line with the point I was trying to make, is that if you have a free good, you're going to consume it. Insatiable or not, you're going to move in that direction for good. And you're going to be led to it because our technological changes are going to be directed at mining that stuff. So biting into natural capital becomes ever cheaper because the incentives are there. And that's how the world is. So the morality is all very good, but we do need incentives to curb our immoral, or if you like, our personal habits. And those incentives require collective action at the local level, right up to the international level. And I see absolutely no evidence of it. And that is why I think you youngsters in the front rows here have a hell of a lot of work to do. Take it seriously. We are looking at your children and your grandchildren.
Would you like a chance to ask a question?
I want to both agree with Professor Dasguptha, but also disagree and argue that I think he is being facetious about Keynes, actually. Yes, I agree completely that the economy and the way that the economy is currently constructed means that we are rapacious about the ecosystem within which we live. But why? How did that come about? And Professor Dasguptha ended his remarks by saying we have to take action at a local all the way through to an international level. And I completely agree with that. That was Keynes's view. And for me, And I am a co-author of something called the Green New Deal, plus I have a background in debt and finance. And so I see these two things as completely linked. If you live in a world, Professor Dasguptha, of easy money, where it's possible to take out a loan to consume, where NatWest can argue, take the wanting out of waiting, so that you can borrow to consume today, and if you can consume at any rate because you can borrow, and borrowing is easy, there's no regulation over borrowing, well, of course, you're going to go shopping. There is a direct line between easy credit, shopping, and easy jet, in my view, right? Consumption and emissions. And we've done nothing to manage this easy money. Furthermore, if you have to pay back those debts, that borrowing, at rates of interest that are in fact rising exponentially, you have to exploit the ecosystem exponentially to raise the funds to repay your debt. So Brazil has to strip her forests in order to raise the hard currency to repay her debts. We have to fish the seas of all the fish in order to repay exponentially rising debt. And what do we do about rising debt and the rising cost of debt? We say, leave it to the market. And we blame, who do we blame? We blame ourselves for being some kind of passive creatures who were faced by the fate of, and where are the economists? What are their economic and mathematical models doing about this rapaciousness?
They're here on the table.
Why is it happening? And what exactly have economists done to restabilize the economy, which is is most unstable, and B, the ecosystem? Nothing. They've left it to something called the invisible hand. And when it comes to the creation of credit and to consumption and so forth. So, Keynes was very clear that you had to manage credit at this local level, you had to manage it at a national level, and you had to manage it internationally, because it was the thing that drove consumption all the way through. And you had to manage that too. And it's the attitude of, well, no, let's not manage anything, which has driven us into this rapacious state, which I think threatens the ecosystem. So I want to ask Professor Dasguptha exactly what have economists done with their economic models to prevent this happening? What advice have they got?
Oh, wow.
That is a rhetorical question.
No. This is you're absolutely right for asking. I'm not a trade union member, so I can't be held responsible for what my colleagues do. I thought perhaps much of what I said was actually an attack on my profession. I'm senior enough and well-placed enough to be able to do that. I haven't had much impact, but what the hell, one tries. I think the idea that easy credit is doing the dirty on the kinds of issues that I was raising. You have perfectly good points to make on the issue that you are raising, but to think that easy credit is the responsible for this is a complete rubbish. No. This is a free good here. We're talking about even the credit wasn't right. We're looking at distorted incentives for people. We have an enormous swath of stuff, mangroves, the deep oceans, the wetlands. Large swaths of stuff out there are essentially free. 250 years ago, 100 years ago even, you did not have chainsaws, you did not have bulldozers of a kind which can cut right through the Amazon without blink. You did not have fishing equipment which could cut deep into the deep oceans and just take what you can get. That's technological progress, which is extremely important, but it's misdirected because the pricing system is wrong. And I'm concentrating on the distorted pricing system, not just through the market prices, but the incentives that states give to individuals to carry out their lives. This has very little to do with credit. Even if credit were constrained in the way you would like, and we're in agreement, but you're actually directing it the wrong problem.
Marketizing the ecosystem is not the answer to...
I've not said that it needs to be marketized. No matter what the institution is, it's a cheap good. The Soviet Union was ruining the Aral Sea. It wasn't a market failure, it was state failure. When communities destroy their local ecosystem, it's not market failure, it's community failure. I'm talking now about institutions ruining, not having the wherewithal to be able to give the right signals to participants, the members of the institute who are engaged in this, who are members within the institutions, to take care of a factor of production, which we take care of. This table is taken care of. Why? Ask yourself that. If I started jumping on this, the bursar of Keynes is going to come running to it, telling me not to do it. You can see the point. If it's out there, unmonitored, uncontrolled, just for gratification, he will destroy it. A little bit of it, of course, because others will. I make my point. It's nothing to do with private property, it's nothing to do with markets, it's to do with institutions. Markets just one set of institutions.
The point is incomplete, because earlier on in your remarks you said, well, morality is all right, but human nature is such that if you have a free good, then of course it'll just be consumed to the limit. But morality isn't just something there, and all you have to do is to provide, I mean, you say the problem is to provide the right incentive structure, the right systems of control. But morality is very, very crucial, because it directs you to what conduct is good and what conduct is bad. And so that's the other side of the problem. Rapacity is an element in the overconsumption of the natural stock of the world. And you can't really, I think, or I would disagree if you argued that that would be so whatever morality there was.
Sorry, just very quickly.
Very quickly. I think you really are misunderstanding me. The issue isn't that we shouldn't be good. How could you conceivably say morality is bad news? That's not the issue.
But
The issue is it hasn't had a cutting power. If you study the anthropologist's work on villages in Africa and rural communities in Africa or Bihar, you will see enormous constraints imposed on members of the community to take fruit from the tree, at what time of the year, how much, and so forth. It wasn't so much morality, it was social norms.
Okay. Fine.
And Andrew, would you like to ask a question of the panelists before we open it up?
Yeah, well, I was going to comment on that, but I won't. I wanted to take up something that Robert said about, Robert did mention automation, and it would be good to explore that a little further, because obviously automation is something which inspired lots of dystopias in the course of the 20th century. One of my favorite was a novel by Kurt Vonnegut, Player Piano, which has the image of a meritocratic elite, very similar to the corporate elite of modern America, who live in gated compounds. And the whole of the rest of the population is living in slums on the edge of these gleaming cities, which only the elite operate within. And of course that was a problem which James Mead analysed in the 1960s. And I wonder whether, Robert, you have anything more to say about, in terms of the distinctions you were laying out between different sorts of work. What is the implications for work if we move to a society which relies on automation, and particularly on robots, to do so many of the daily things that we rely on?
Well, I would say they're pretty dire. I mean, this is an argument that goes right back to Ricardo and the Luddites. And it's easy to say, well, the Luddites were wrong, and they were wrong. They were completely wrong. I mean, in fact, the machines didn't destroy, it destroyed their jobs. Of course, their jobs were gone, but it created lots of other jobs and so on. So, but what's happened is that automation has speeded up unbelievably the pace of job destruction. And the question one has to ask ourselves is not that there won't be replacement jobs for the jobs being destroyed. I think some surveys, quite reputable ones, suggest that about 50% of existing jobs are at risk through automation in the United States, and similar figures are suggested for the UK. I mean, the question is not whether there won't be replacement jobs, but whether there will be enough replacement jobs. And so I think we have to reconsider lots of things about work. I mean, first of all, what is a full-time job? Is a part-time job going to be more and more usual in the future? And if we can also develop a system of work in which you're not paid pro rata in the way that you now are if you take a part-time job. If you take a part-time job, you lose income. But of course, if that's the case, then of course people are going to resist. So we've got a number of things to sort out. How fast do we want automation to go? Have we got any control of it? Is there a technological determinism at work, which means we just have to go at the pace of the technical possibilities of automating the economy? Do we just say, well, that's just inevitable? Or do we actually think of social controls that can slow down the pace of change? I think slowing down is absolutely crucial. And it was the gradualness of the introduction of new technology in the 19th and early 20th century which actually enabled the human beings to adapt to it. If it all comes with a rush, we're in a terrible crisis.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take some questions now. Please put your hand up, and Lenny or Izzy will come to you with the microphone. Yeah, down here, Izzy. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Camille Rivier, and
sorry, could you hold the microphone closer?
Sorry, is that a little better?
That's perfect.
Okay. You touched on a couple of things. I want to sort of link a couple of them, if you don't mind. You touched on the tragedy of the commons, the tendency for people that have open access to resources that is completely unchecked will use them to the point of depletion. And this is one of the issues we're running into. But when we talk about free things, and I don't think you necessarily mean it this way, I think one of the issues we have in the economics models is that we devalue future cost of economic resources. And this is a key factor as far as I can, as far as I have learned and can tell with the economic model we have, but it is linked as well to the financial issues. And I think where it becomes important is that when we're thinking about things more globally, and when you talked about wealth going up in certain countries and down in the majority, I think where we're not linking that is that the wealth that is going up in certain countries, it is because we are using the resources of the other countries without accounting for the external costs to the environment, to the individuals, and the fact that extreme poverty is the greatest driver of environmental degradation. And so that if people have access to funds and small microloans, things of this nature, in more impoverished areas, if women are educated and if environmental factors are regulated and properly accounted for in economic models, then this starts to level off some of these issues and starts to link some of these issues. And yes, I agree that economic or that financial regulation is critical, and that money that is affordable and accessible is critical, but it has to be accessible to people across the globe. It has to be accessible not just to the elite. And and we have to step into the reality that our gluttonous level of consumption is not sustainable. And so I guess I want to hear, from you where you feel economically we can intervene in some of these fundamental issues.
Thank you very much. These are profoundly interesting. You've hit the right buttons, no question about it. Every one of them. To try and tie it up. I think a great deal of my work in the 1990s was about the poverty-environment linkage. So I'm very sensitive to your thought, but I think we overdo it by thinking that gender inequality reduction is going to help the environment necessarily. We should, all my experience, and I'm getting old nowadays, I feel old, is there is no magic bullet. There isn't a single cause. Each is important. Gender inequality goes without saying. Poverty goes without saying. But they are not perfectly correlated. Their reduction is not perfectly correlated with natural capital. You can still have the tragedy of commons at the local level. That requires a kind of institutional, when I say institutional, in the old days, people didn't even use the word institutional. My mother used to say, we do things this way. That's it. She didn't say this is our institution. It wouldn't be in her language. And that was right. And we did it because otherwise mother would feel upset, or father would feel upset, and so forth. So there's a lot more to that. The one you mentioned, the point you mentioned, it's easy. It's very important for those of you who are economists to bear in mind. When China has a great hunger for timber, which it does, and it buys from Indonesia or Malaysia, don't forget there is a wealth transfer from Indonesia and Malaysia to China. Why? Because the negative externalities, quote unquote, that Pigu, another Keynes man, wrote about, that's happening downstream when upstream forests are not being paid for. Now, I know Robert is going to say, what do you mean paying for? This is not a money. I mean in the most generous sense payment. I mean some responsibility, some accountability for it, which is taken into account when the deforestation takes place. So we are having, there's no question about it. We're not talking about now colonialism. We are talking about a perfectly transparent, quote unquote, system, international system, where resources are being transferred from one country to another. It's a free market, it's good, but it's not. There is enormous amount of wealth transfer going in. I think the right way to think about it is to think about the wealth of nations. And we keep on banging on about the income of nations. That's absolutely wrong. It's the wealth of nations. Wealth is a stock. And you want to see whether the stock, in some generalized sense, is depleting through international trade or whatever. And you're quite right. Trade can be extremely harmful unless it's regulated, unless it's understood that, and who pays for it? It's the poor farmers downstream, the poor fishermen downstream. So it's always that. So that's, the correlation is there, you're quite right, but it's not perfect. So don't expect
just
all
very
problems
quickly,
to be solved by only
and then I want to,
policy.
no? Okay, great. Well, we're going to take another couple of questions. Eleni, there's one over there.
I think
Stephen Keynes. This is John Maynard Keynes' nephew.
I think that the main point is being missed out so far. The debate is progressing very interestingly, and a lot of good points are now being made. But one absolutely vital thing that Maynard didn't think about was population growth. And we all recognize it in a sort of way, but it's the failure of all the top people in every country and all the thinkers to understand science. Climate change simply hasn't been understood by the politicians and leaders in every country in the world, but too late. And it's the failure of accepting science. There are no scientists virtually who are MPs. There are no scientists who are top civil servants. And so much is being missed about the future, which has been explained by scientists and is being explained. Until we get a level at which we will listen to the scientists, it's not just a matter for economists, it's a much broader question than that.
On that point, we've also got a question from Twitter, that if, not from a person Twitter, from Andrew through Twitter, is there a humanitarian case for population growth constraints and one-child policies, etc.? Is there anyone who would like to come in?
Well, just on Stephen's question, of course, I mean, Keynes in his little essay it wasn't unconstrained prophecy. He said, provided that, and then one of the conditions was no population growth or limited population growth. Now, of course, he was wrong about that. Well, two things to remember. First of all, he was writing about the Western world, and that was a limitation. But secondly, in 1930 or thereabouts, people were actually very exercised by the threat of population decline. They saw falling birth rate. And so that was the context in which but he didn't ignore it. I mean, it would have been ridiculous. Provided there's no population growth or very little population growth, provided productivity increases at a certain rate, then these are plausible scenarios to look forward to.
Okay, and going back to Andrew's question about what should we do about it?
Well, the best way to deal with population growth is through poverty reduction. We've known that for a very long time. People who are no longer poor don't feel they have to have large families to secure their futures. And it's, the best cure for population growth. But of course, we don't believe that managing the financial system or the economic system in such a way as to ensure that people are not poor is something that we should be doing. No, it's left to some invisible force. Part of what upsets me about this talk about automation and technology and so on is as if there's something happening over which we have no control and cannot have any control. And that's because economics has individualized us into these individual atomic units who operate within our own little worlds, and we cannot operate, apparently, collectively, politically, socially, to enforce the norms that Robert has been talking about and the values that we may have as a society. Instead, we're all left to our own devices, and we're no longer masters of our own fate. Instead, we have to simply await for these awful things to happen to us. Now, I would like us to see the world constructed. I come from Africa. I watched my country's resources be depleted by colonial powers. I lived in a gold mining town, and Cecil John Rhodes and co. came along and stripped us of all of our diamonds and gold, effectively, with the Anglo-American company and so on and so forth. So we've had depletion for a long time, but we took action. My country reacted against colonialism, reacted against just the free ability of rich countries simply to go in and rape and take out from poor countries. We altered the balance of power between those countries. So, we did this through social and political action. We didn't wait to be demolished by these great powerful forces beyond our control. And that's because we were capable of thinking socially, politically, and collectively. Now, we're inclined to think only about ourselves and individually. I have to say that selfies and all of the obsessions associated with nowadays with technology is about me and myself here. It's not about how we're able to act to protect ourselves from the forces of the market, from overpopulation, from the loss of ecosystem assets. And it's that sense that I get from Professor Dasgupta that it's actually we're just living here fatalistically, waiting for something to happen to us. And we need something abstract like the market force to enable us to act. When actually, no, we don't. We need to be able to manage our systems. We need to be able to manage the consumption of the world's resources. We need to be able to manage the distribution of wealth across the world so that we don't have extreme poverty and therefore rising population growth. It's not complicated.
Okay, let's take another question. And again, sorry, we'll go back there, Eleni.
Yeah, thank you very much. You touched on the future of work and unemployment quite many times, actually. And there's one thing, one theory, one concept out there which has different names but is also called universal basic income. Basically giving everyone in a society, however you might define it, a universal income, and then the person can actually decide to work or not, but the security is there, and we might actually go closer to a leisure society, you might call it then. So my question to the panelists actually. So do you think that our grandchildren will actually in the future then maybe able to live in a society where you don't have to work because you have the security, but you decide whether you want to work and then you do what you want to do?
Thank you. Andrew, would you like to come in on that one?
Yeah, the basic income is an idea which has been developing over the last 100 years, and in some ways the welfare state developed in advanced countries is a gradual series of steps towards the creation of a basic income, but we're still a long way from actually achieving a complete basic income, and that's partly because the politics of basic income are very difficult indeed because of the expectation that work should be linked to earning to some sort of productive activity, and earning a living is central to the way in which we conceive of work and therefore the gaining of incomes. But it seems to me that the basic income, which has been developed by a whole series of economists and philosophers, sociologists, political scientists, who've all written about it, that this is an idea that will get increasing traction in future years, and it's one of the points where we could think about a transition to a very different kind of society, and a society which takes seriously stocks. I mean, but there's a very difficult political transition to take place. I mean, educating democracies is a very hard matter, as Keynes knew, and the point about science, I think, goes to the heart of this. It's a very profound issue of how actually you persuade democracies to act on the best information that is available. And in political science, that is a non-trivial question.
Okay, let's take another question. Again, if you could just put your hand up so either Izzy or Eleni could see. No one?
Stunned.
Yeah. Jeff.
So my question is quite simple. It seems to me a bit peculiar to assess Keynes on the basis of remarks he made about supply and technology when most of his work was concerned with demand.
Okay, Robert?
Well, I think, this was an essay where he said, I mean, he started in, I think, the very, very first sentences, say, let's take wing. What if we can free ourselves from what's going on at this moment in time, which was 1930, at the depth of the Great Depression, let's take wing and see what future can we look forward to, because he then said, look, although we're in this terrible mess, we are actually in the process of solving our economic problem, and by the time of our grandchildren, we can start thinking about the permanent problems of life, which is how to live agreeably and well. And I think what Professor Dasguptha has done very cleverly is to turn the subject of the conversation to something else, because really Keynes was writing a morality tale. And it's sort of somehow been turned into a question of overconsumption of the capital stock, or a free good. And that, I don't think, I mean, it's a very important topic in its own right.
Thank you.
And it could be, yeah, wait a minute, but that wasn't actually the topic we were here, I think, to concentrate on. And what I wanted to say was it should be married to what Keynes wrote, but not dismiss Keynes as being just totally wrong, which is what essentially you said in that essay. So that's what I really objected to. I think, there are ways in which you can combine these two topics in a very fruitful way.
Partha, do you want to come back on that?
just putting it slightly different way from my friend Robert. Most his correct me if I'm wrong, Bob. His technical work, the work for which he's most renowned in the external world, was on the short run. He was facing a world in which 25–30% of the working force was unemployed, factories lay idle, and this was an allocation of capital assets at the time. The long run was out of it's not in the general theory, and rightly so too. So this is absolutely correct. This is one occasion. Maybe there were other occasions. Robert knows every page he's ever written. He talked about the long run. The one paper I would, those of you who are minded to read classics, and even if you're not, you should. There is a fantastic paper written in 1928 by another Kingsman. This is a fantastic college, actually. Frank Ramsey, the Optimizing the Rate of Savings. Now there, and Keynes was editor of the Economic Journal, so he published it. It's a mathematical piece, and I promise you, when I first read it, only a few years ago, I should have read it dozens of years ago, but it's a classic. You don't read classics, it's already there in the ether. When I first read it, I felt it could have been written last week, and I read it, I think, in 1995 or something. And there, the long run was really long. It was an infinite horizon. The world never comes to an end. And he's asking himself, how should we think about accumulation of assets, of wealth? Of course, he got the model wrong. He didn't have natural capital in it, but that's okay. This was 1928. If he had solved that, I would have been out of business. I think, Bob, you are being naughty here. The issue is not about turning the question. This essay is economic possibilities for our grandchildren. What the hell? That's exactly what I was addressing. For my grandchildren, not his, mine. And,
Thank you.
To pretend that natural capital is not of the utmost importance and that we're screwing up Earth, it would be just unthinkable.
And then we'll take another question.
I think it was a very good question, and the reason is this. You know, we're sitting here very comfortably, warmly, most of us pretty well off, really. But we're living in a world where there's been a collapse in global demand, which is reflected in deflation and very high rates of unemployment and an overhang of private debt, which is deflating and depressing the economy. And that's leading and is going to lead to even higher unemployment. We're living on the end of a continent which faces the threat of fascism. It's very real. Unemployment, movement of people because of unemployment in the Middle East is obscene, right? And these people, there's war, there's conflict, there's unrest, and there's all other reasons why we have these movements of people. But this is leading us precisely into the 1930s once again. And Keynes was saying that he thought we could prevent that from happening, but we have not prevented that from happening. And I have to say to Professor Dasgupta, what on earth is going to happen to the capital stock, to the natural capital stock, when we have another fascist war? And I'm not being merely alarmist here. There are awful things happening very, very close to us. We feel very content and safe in our corners, but we ought not to feel safe because the global economy is in a lot of trouble, and the economists don't understand it. And they go off in different directions, talking about all kinds of abstract things, and we are facing the political and social and economic reality of a collapse in global demand, deflation, rises in unemployment, think of the steel industry, and with it, rises in political disruption and unrest. That's not something that I want to leave for my grandchildren, and I have got grandchildren. And that's not something I want my children to have to face, because it's near enough for my children to have to face it. So I just want to challenge, because I think the ecosystem is going to be massively damaged, as it is in the Middle East, by these economic policies. And I feel as strongly as he does about this. But we are just always talking about everything else except these fundamental forces that now threaten both us and our grandchildren.
Thank you. And our final question comes from Dr. Stephen Cherry, the Dean of King's, and he asks on Twitter, will our grandchildren be more worried about war, work, water, or debt? Andrew, could you start us off? That was war, work, water, or debt.
I think they'll be worried about all of those. And I think, because I think that all of those, I mean, for me, they all come down to politics. And they all, but our biggest problem is, I mean, what I have always taken from that Keynes essay, and did so when I reread it for the purposes of this panel, is that, I mean, Keynes is painting a utopian vision of the possibilities that are in our grasp, but he doesn't go into any of the problems of how we actually achieve that. The political constraints, the need to build institutions which can get political cooperation, not just within countries, but across countries. And I think the inability to do that is the thing which will most frustrate the achievement of Keynes's vision. So I think all those things, war and work and debt, these are all things which we have to worry about, and we have to find political solutions. And political solutions, as we know, come about through very painstaking work of building agreement and getting persuasion and trying to create conditions which mean that those things don't happen. And there are periods of human history where we have been quite successful at building those institutions. There are other periods where we have been very unsuccessful. And the problem when politics goes wrong, everything goes wrong. And that's one of the big lessons of the past, but it's also the lesson of the present.
Thank you. And would anyone else, before we wrap up, like to come on to that war, work,
Well,
water,
I can just answer. I think people will worry about work. But I think we'll have lots of wars to remove that worry, and they'll destroy lots of human and physical capital and create lots of work for people to do again. That's usually how problems of demand have been dealt with historically.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our panelists. That is all we have time for. Thank you all for coming. I'm also, oh, sorry. I'm also incredibly grateful to the extraordinary King's Politics Executive who have put on this evening's debate, so a huge thank you to you. I hope that you get a chance to see the exhibition devoted to John Maynard Keynes' essay, which is at the back of the antechapel now. I also hope you'll join us for a drink in the bar, and I hope to see you again at King's Politics' next public event, which is on the 1st of December, where we'll be discussing, has the UK education system failed white working class boys? Thank you all.